Last week we observed the first Sunday in what has come to be known as the Season for Nonviolence, and this was started in 1998. It was done in memory of the life work of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King. It starts on January 30th, which was the date that Gandhi was assassinated, and then it goes all the way until April 4th, which was the date when the same thing happened to Dr. King. Now, nonviolence is certainly a worthy goal, but as Dr. King once wrote, it's not enough to simply refrain from violence. We're not going to get there by simply refraining from violence. We have to do something positive. Here's what he said. We will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It's not enough to say we must not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. We must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but on the positive affirmation of peace. So that led me to consider what it is that we can do that would be a positive step. Instead of just promising to refrain from something, what can we do? And I thought it might be a good step in that direction to spend a few weeks on something that's called nonviolent communication, which can also be called compassionate communication. Again, we're doing something positive instead of just promising to refrain from something, which would be that negative path that Dr. King was talking about. Nonviolent communication is a process that's designed to teach us a way of communicating which leads to empathy and connection rather than separation. It's going to teach us to be more objective when we're dealing with others, and it's going to lead to a greater sense of self-awareness. We're going to be more objective about what we're observing in the other person, and we're going to be in tune with what's going on within us. That's going to help us to develop more control and more precision regarding our subjective impressions, our feelings, our emotions, and all those things that can come up and hijack our train of thought when we really need to be clear and focused on what we're doing. Now, all of this comes from a book by Marshall Rosenberg that's called Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life. Another subtitle for it is A Language of Compassion, which is why it's sometimes called compassionate communication. So today we're going to start with chapter 2, where he talks about 4 different ways of communicating that can block connection, compassion, and empathy. Sometimes, right, there are things that we need to unlearn before we can effectively learn something new. So, the first form of communication that can block compassion is making moralistic judgments. We state a conclusion without offering or maybe even being aware of what evidence there is to support this conclusion that we've just offered to the other person. And many times we reach a conclusion and state it without any real evidence. Now, another word for that is prejudice. That's not a judgment either. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We often do things without being aware of what's going on. There have been recent experiments in psychology that show that we are constantly making judgments, reaching conclusions that are based on a person's appearance alone. This is something we learned about in the Frontiers of Consciousness class last month. They do these experiments where they make these computer-generated faces that are racially, ethnically neutral, even gender neutral in many cases, just basically a computer-generated face with different expressions, different features. And they were amazed to find how people were more than willing to judge a person's competence and honesty. They were told to pick out the faces that they thought showed a person who was honest or competent or both, and they had all sorts of other factors, but we don't need to go into those. They would make conclusions regarding honesty and competence based on only seeing pictures. Now, that should send a little chill up and down your spine when you think about it, because how can we possibly know anything about competence or honesty or anything else for that matter based on appearance alone? But it happens all the time. And here's the chilling thing. It happens all the time when people are in the voting booth or when they are in the process of choosing a candidate. We classify and we judge other people based on our own needs and values instead of focusing on the only things that we can ever know about another person, which are their words and their actions. And if we don't know those things, then we really don't know enough to make a conclusion like that. Let me give you an example here of what it's like to judge someone based on our own needs and values, to make a judgment based on our own needs and values before we even know anything about the person or their real behavior. Here's a situation where a person calls another person aloof and insensitive. Now, I'm sure we'll all agree that aloof and insensitive, those are not exactly positive words. And they're judgmental. It's a conclusion. You are aloof and insensitive. There's been no articulation of what conduct or anything else supports that conclusion, but so often people will do that. Well, perhaps the person making that judgment simply needs to have more attention and affection in that particular relationship and isn't getting it. It's about their needs, or as that song said, I believe this belongs to you, right? You got to own it. You got to own it rather than projecting it on the other person. Aloof and sensitive doesn't enter into the picture at all at this point until the person making those statements realizes what their own needs are and how that is driving this situation. They need more attention. They need more affection in this context. So why not lead with that? Instead of jumping to the conclusion and slapping the label on them of aloof and insensitive, slapping the judgment of aloof and insensitive on them. Which do you think is more likely to lead to constructive communication? Leading with the need or observation, I need more attention and affection, or jumping to the conclusion and judgment, you're aloof and insensitive? That's an easy one. But it happens all the time, and it's something we have to learn how to do. Another thing that we learned last month in that Frontiers of Consciousness class was about these two different modes of thinking that appear to be hardwired into our brains. I think we have them up here. This is from the work of Daniel Kahneman. System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 is instinctive, it's quick, doesn't require much effort, it's emotion driven, it's automatic, and there's no sense of voluntary control over it. Now that's not to say we can't control it, we'll get to that, but there's no immediate sense of deliberation. Whereas System 2 is complex, it's slow, we're aware of it, it's more logical, we can call it analytical, it requires effort. A lot of what happens comes out of that System 1 way of thinking. And I'll just put in a plug for this month's Frontiers of Consciousness class. This month we're going to be listening to some of the work of Daniel Dennett, who tells us about things that we can actually do to improve our System 1 type thinking. So that could be useful. But the problem here is that, well, first of all, System 1 thinking, it helps us survive. It has its purpose. It helps us to get by and survive in situations where we simply don't have time to make a deliberate analysis of the situation. That's okay. The other way that's more deliberate, more analytic, and takes effort, that may not be so useful in a situation where we have very limited amount of time to make a decision. But on the other hand, when we're communicating with someone and we're trying to connect, we want to have that slow, deliberate, conscious process that we're going to be involved in to really help to make that connection work, in order to override that reactive way of thinking, which is what can lead to those kinds of snap conclusions and judgments. It can get in the way of us being aware of our needs and things like that. So this is important. Okay, the second thing that sets up a barrier to empathy and compassion in our communication is making comparisons. Making comparisons. There was a book, it's out of print now, but the book was by Dan Greenberg that was called How to Make Yourself Miserable. I can sum it up in one line here. The basic idea is that if you sincerely desire to make yourself miserable, start learning how to compare yourself to other people. It's that simple. It's that simple. Theodore Roosevelt once said this. He said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." Another way I've heard it put is, compare leads to despair. That's a good one. It's one thing to have a role model. Role models are great. A role model is someone who exhibits a skill or a quality that we can reasonably hope to emulate in our own way. They serve as an example, an inspiration, and maybe give us some clues about ways to improve whatever it is that we want to do. So here's a clever way to say that. Instead of compare and despair, it's admire and aspire. Admire and aspire. Now, one can admire and study Mozart as a way to learn music composition. On the other hand, few people can hope to achieve what Mozart did by the time he was a teenager. He spoke several languages, he had major compositions being performed by renowned orchestras. Here's what the great master himself had to say on this subject of comparison. He said, "It's a mistake to think that the practice of my art has become easy to me. I assure you, dear friend, no one has given so much care to the study of composition as I. There is scarcely a famous master in music whose works I have not frequently and diligently studied." So even he had role models. Even he had role models, and that's what helped to make him who he was. And before we're done with Mozart, here's a little humor for all you classical music lovers. Why are you hiding the truth from me? Because you can't handle it. A little humor, right? Very little. All right. Seriously now, folks. Back to the subject at hand, comparisons. So if making these kinds of dysfunctional comparisons about ourselves leads to misery, why would we want to do it to others? And yet, don't we hear people saying things like, well, why can't you be more like your older brother or sister or whatever it is? Or the opposite example is, you remind me of my ex. Fill in the blank, right? It doesn't matter if the comparison's positive or negative. What we're doing is we're sending this message that the other person needs to be fundamentally different in order to be acceptable. And when that kind of message is in the mix, communication, empathy, and compassion just don't stand a chance. It's not going to happen. Now, a third way to block communication, compassion, and empathy is called denial of responsibility. What we're looking for here is language that obscures our personal responsibility. So denial of responsibility usually starts with something like saying, well, I had to because, you fill in the blank. I had to because it was my job. Or I was just following orders. Or he made me angry. I had to because he made me angry. Here's a big one. I had to do it because I had no choice. Is that ever really true? Even in the hypothetical situation where someone has a gun to our head, the most accurate thing we can say is that I did it because there was a gun to my head and I chose to do the thing because I didn't want to die. I think just about anyone could empathize with that. Now, I would have hoped after the Nuremberg trials, where the defense for so many of the people on trial was that I was just following orders. I would have thought after the Nuremberg trials, the world might understand that following orders is an unacceptable explanation for just about anything, but we still hear people reciting rules, laws, policies, and regulations as if they absolve us from taking responsibility. So here's where it fits into communication. It's difficult, if not impossible, to build a relationship built on trust and compassion when we insist that our choices are compelled by something outside ourselves. And here's the irony. When we deny responsibility, we never gain any ground by doing that. We do it as a defense mechanism, thinking we have something to gain from it, but we actually lose because we are giving away our power to that thing outside us, the job, the rules, the orders. All right, the last thing that they talk about, which can block communication, is when we make demands instead of requests. Now, we touched on this last week. So often we labor under this mistaken impression that we have some degree of control over how other people show up in the world. That we can somehow persuade them, non-violently of course, to change. But it always involves some form of manipulation, reward and punishment, demand and retribution, and all of that is generally unhealthy. There was a passage in the book where Marshall Rosenberg talks about how this could work in a family setting. This is based on his experience. He says, "My children gave me some invaluable lessons about demands. Somehow I had gotten it into my head that, as a parent, my job was to make demands. Here were these youngsters letting me know that I couldn't make them do anything. All I could do was make them wish they had, through punishment. Then eventually they taught me that any time I was foolish enough to make them wish they had complied by punishing them, they had ways of making me wish that I hadn't." True? And around we go in the cycle of misery and dysfunction of communication, or even non-communication. There has to be another way. There has to be a better way, which is why this book came into being. And this better way of communicating and really connecting based on empathy and compassion has 4 major components that we're going to start talking about today. Those components are observation, feeling, needs, and request. Those are the 4 steps. And it all starts with learning how to observe without evaluating. This takes us back to that first block that we talked about, offering judgments and evaluations instead of making observations. Now that doesn't mean we can never evaluate, okay? That's another form of metaphysical malpractice we commit on ourselves. Is I remember this has probably been about, maybe 20 years ago when Karen and I were first getting involved in Unity. For some reason back then, everybody had this allergy to the word judgment. And I don't know, it was a popular book at the time or something like that, but people wanted to excise the word judgment from their vocabulary. And you don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. There are times for judgment based on logic and observation, making an evaluation, but not in the context of this kind of interpersonal communication. What we have to learn how to do is to try to keep our observations and evaluations separate from each other. Keep our observations and evaluations separate. So let me give you an example here to get started on this topic. Let's say that you have a teenager at home who leaves dirty dishes all around the house and they never clean their room or put their clothes away. I know it's a stretch. But, I was going to say use your imagination, but if any of that looks familiar, there you go. Now, telling the kid that she's lazy and inconsiderate is an evaluation, not an observation of objective reality. may be true, but it's still an evaluation, which is the same as one of those judgments we just talked about, which blocks compassion, blocks communication. If you lead, if you have a need for greater cleanliness in the house and you want to express that need, you're going to get nowhere if you lead with, hey, come over here, you lazy and inconsiderate so-and-so. That's going to kill it from the very beginning. So instead of jumping to the evaluation, how about we simply start with making a couple of careful observations? We might say something like, I noticed that I can't walk across your bedroom without stepping on your clothes. Could be just an absolutely true observation, depending on how dense the chaos is in that room. Or you might start by saying something like, I noticed that the bowl you used for popcorn, ice cream, whatever, is still on the couch next to you where you were sitting last night. Pure observations. Again, telling someone that they're lazy and inconsiderate is a sure way to cut off communication. And yet, how often do we lead with the evaluation instead of making that kind of a simple, objective observation? And then we wonder why conversation goes downhill from there. Marshall Rosenberg, in addition to being, he was a PhD psychologist, and I think I mentioned that this book is the product of his PhD dissertation. So there's a lot of work that went into this, but he's also a poet. And he was able to put a lot of his key ideas into verse. And here's just a few verses that he wrote that talks about this key step in the process of nonviolent communication. Here's what he says. He says, I can handle your telling me what I did or didn't do, and I can handle your interpretations. But please, don't mix the two. If you want to confuse any issue, I can tell you how to do it. Mix together what I do with how you react to it. That's kind of cool, isn't it? Kind of reminds me of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory with the Oompa Loompas, you know, doing the verses that kind of capture the essence of the message. But there it is. Mix together what I do with how you react to it. So that's it for today. Next week we're going to pick up with observation again, and we're going to talk about how we tend to mix the two, and maybe we'll do a little interactive session with some exercises for recognizing how to distinguish observations from evaluations. So if that's interesting, come on back. We'll see you next week. Thank you.